How's it going? And welcome to a fistful of movies this week or month or wherever the scheduling is. You can never know when the show is going to drop. I'm joined by Dennis Cadigan to talk about Top Gun Maverick. Dennis, how did you feel about the first movie? Were you a fan?
I actually, the first time I saw Top Gun, I barely even remembered it. I would say I was probably a teenager, and it
Yeah.
just made no impact on me because I was looking for a kind of a Con Air, The Rock kind of thing when I knew it was a Bruckheimer movie, slickly produced and all the rest.
Mm.
And I was expecting probably more action in that sense. So there was a lot of, as you know, like cheesy 80s montages and all the rest. And I'd say on second viewing, I came
Bum
around to it
bum
a bit
bum bum
more,
bum.
but it's very much like a kind of, you know, I guess like a product placement for joining the naval service and the air service and all the rest of it, like the slow-mo bits. It is well directed. It was one of Tom Cruise's, it probably was his first major blockbusters, as we would say. Like, he had a few notable roles before that, but it's the first one that really put him on the map, and like he got his first massive payday for that as well. So yeah, it definitely has like
Yeah.
a very notable place in movie history, but I wouldn't have said I'd been a massive fan of it in any way.
Yeah, and we probably wouldn't have said either in a culture that commodifies and sequels and finds a way to milk every franchise imaginable. When I found out there was going to be a Top Gun sequel, I didn't really think it was something that needed to be made. But you can say that about almost everything. But this one in particular, I struggled to think where they could go with this. I presume the fact that you said you were looking for something after Con Air and things like that, you seen it as a teenager. I seen it probably when I was 11 or 12. Don't remember much about it other than Goose dying, which evidently is all you really need to remember for Top Gun Maverick. But I presume you seen it as a teenager.
The first Top Gun, yeah, and
Yeah.
honestly, like I said, the first time I saw it, it didn't leave a massive kind of impression on me in terms of, well, I was going to say the plot, but let's face it, there's not really much of that either. It's kind of a collection of scenes. They said it was the kind of the rise of the formula blockbuster. You had like the volleyball montage, the scene where he's trying to pick up his training instructor Kelly McGillis in the pub and stuff, and there's just so many scenes kind of that could almost be patched together, which doesn't necessarily add up to a whole. I mean, you could see why critics weren't enamored with it in the slightest, but then audiences would flock to it because again, it was your perfectly packaged kind of blockbuster, very, very thin in terms of like plot or even kind of ideas, you could say, but the flight sequences were really good. You can see it even if on a rewatch now for a movie made in 1986, I would say it stands up quite well in terms of like the sequencing. But again, yeah, like Tony Scott, Bruckheimer, it obviously costs a lot of money, and they are pros. You can definitely say that much about all the kind of the production and the marketing around the film, and like that's probably what tided it over in some respects, I suppose. That people clearly remembered it, even if we wouldn't have considered ourselves big fans of it. Like, despite the fact that I would say, both like Tom Cruise, it's not something we would put in our top fives of his movies or anything like that.
Yeah. And it does seem to be somewhat of a cultural phenomenon for, I guess, maybe people 10 or 15 years older than us. I mean, even in Meet the Parents, there's references to Iceman, and it seems to be something that was in the zeitgeist that at a certain time. It's certainly something that I didn't feel like I needed to rewatch. We haven't talked about Top Gun Maverick, but I absolutely loved it, and maybe I should have put in the work to watch the original, and it would have meant a bit more to me. But I think they covered it with flashbacks. But as someone who watched this in quick succession, maybe you'll have a different perspective. But we talk about Tom Cruise, Dennis. I was talking to another friend of mine the other day. Is he the last movie star there is?
Yeah, I think
Like,
so, especially after the summer that we've had, you could say, like in terms of new releases. Now, I know a lot of that's been changed. Like, you can take in a lot of factors into that. Like, say, the last two summers with the pandemic releases slowing down, and then it really kind of coincided with the rise of straight to video, didn't it? In the sense of like Netflix, Plus, you just release it on the platform. good movies even are being released and don't get a cinematic release. So then there's a real kind of
Yeah,
lack of quality in terms of the summer blockbuster front. And you could say, like, I think it's dipping again now in terms of the money that they're taking in. So you can see that like the effect is terrible and it's happening earlier than usual. So there wasn't a lot on the horizon. I think in retrospect, there was a lot riding on it to do well. And even though it's
yeah,
been like a massive financial success, I mean, a current, I think it's about 1.5 billion or coming out close to that worldwide,
yeah,
which is great anyway. But then it's even better when you consider that because of a few political reasons, it wasn't released in China or Russia. So that's like, well, China obviously is a massive market. So taking that out of the equation, it's an unanimous success really in terms of like how much money it's made as a
yeah.
blockbuster. You could wish for more.
I actually didn't know about the China thing, but remind me of that in a minute because it did make me wonder about the faceless enemies in this movie. But we'll get to it in a minute. Um, yeah, I think a lot of cinema has been taking up at the moment with Marvel, and I'm not going to have a big go at Marvel. People who like those movies, that's fair enough. A lot of people get enjoyment out of it. A lot of my friends do. My partner does. But one problem I have with it is it takes up a lot of cinema space for movies that might. I mean, Top Gun Maverick is a franchise movie to an extent, but to in another way, it's much more of a throwback to those kind of 90s, kind of 80s movies, Speed, Con Air, which you mentioned. It's very much in that mold of a good old fashioned action movie. And I knew it had me from the opening moments when Tom Cruise he's flying this kind of mega jet. I don't know what it's called. And the stakes is he has to hit 10 G force, I believe it is. I'm not a pilot. I'm just trying to recount it. And
Yeah, that's right.
Grumpy Ed Harris has just driven in to shut down the program because it hasn't been doing well. Tom Cruise hijacks this jet, flies off into the sky, and it's up to him to hit this target. Now, I'm used to end of the world movies, CGI, things like that seem to impress other people. And again, I'm not having a go, but it just doesn't feel real to me. This felt real in such a micro stakes way, in the sense we get a look at the dial of 8, 9. Is it going to hit 10? We look back at Ed Harris disapprovingly staring at the screen as well. The people who are in charge of the program. So it's not just, in fact, it's not at all CGI, which we'll get to, and I'm sure you'll want to talk about. But it's just how you block a scene and how you build excitement over something as innocuous these days in movie stakes as someone trying to beat a record in a plane. Like, I thought that was very good.
Yeah, it kind of it sets its stall out right from the beginning as well. And you mentioned that you haven't rewatched the original, but I'm guessing you can tell that right from the credit sequence, they replay the Top Gun theme, they replay the Kenny Loggins, and even though, like I said again, I wasn't a massive fan of the original, I said it's okay, it's cheesy, it has its place. A lot of people like it. It was a huge success in the day, but I felt in the cinema as soon as they were playing that back as I was, this is being done right, this is timed right. There's a fine line
Yeah.
of 80s stuff that kind of came back into volition a bit in terms of like, is this a good kind of homage to a previous movie, or is it just a complete cheesy ripoff, or like,
Yeah.
fan service as well? It's all about the timing, and I felt that right from that beginning, the opening credits, they just timed it well. And actually, I got a good
Yeah.
feeling of the movie right away from the way that they just kind of, like you said, the way that they packaged it from the credits, and that's well taking off in the jet. And everything worked, it was exciting right away from the start. It was funny. Like you said, Ed Harris, you could already tell the kind of caliber of actors who would be cast in the roles that they would fit into that position. And I mean, who better to play a grumpy admiral than Ed Harris? He just like, he just
Yeah.
screams military man, and yeah. I was actually hoping, yeah, that's pretty much his only scene as well. I was actually hoping for more from him in it because, yeah, he's just such a great actor and he kind of slotted into that role so easily. And yeah, from there on, it keeps getting better as well, as I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll get into.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to harken back to the blockbusters we have at the moment. and things like Marvel. But I think it is a fair kind of comparison. And a friend of mine brought up this point. Does this movie feel better because it's something different to the almost CGI painting, magical colors, fakeness of cinema now, or is it a good movie in its own right? And I certainly think that it gets extra points for being not a kind of CGI fest, but it's also a very good movie in its own right. And we mentioned Tom Cruise. I'm actually a big fan of Tom Cruise, and let me tell you a story I learned about Tom Cruise. I think it was yesterday I read it. So I don't know if you like this movie. I do. I suspect you don't. But when Anne Rice found out that Tom Cruise was cast for Interview with the Vampire, Tom Cruise was so disheartened by it that she was against his casting. He read all her books. He went around France and started indulging in the hedonistic lifestyle of the main character Lestat. And I think Tom Cruise is this generation's almost Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Jackie Chan, in the sense of the commitment to getting that shot, getting that wow factor. And one thing he did for Top Gun was he insisted every actor learn how to pilot a plane, and not just a basic plane. He basically took them on a pilot course. And this isn't an auteur going crazy. This is, again, because he's the producer, he's never actually directed a movie, but this is commitment to a shot. And this ties into what's real, because we get the cockpit shots, we get the gravity, the almost pacing of how a jet would react. We always know where we are in relation to the camera because it's fixated on something that's real. And in a movie in the air, it's all the more better for something that feels that you can almost touch. And that's down to Cruise, from what I heard. Although Joseph, what's his name? Joseph Kolowinski?
Kaczynski,
Yeah,
isn't it? Yeah,
Kaczynski. Even though his movies aren't particularly always good, he certainly knows how to direct action sequences as well.
Yeah, and you've seen more by him than I have, I think, because aside from this, I think I'd only seen the firefighter film, Only the Brave, which I really enjoyed as well. That was well directed.
Yeah.
It was almost more of a drama, I would say, than Top Gun Maverick is. But yeah, I enjoyed that. And you mentioned he was in, he did Oblivion with Tom Cruise as well. I haven't seen that, but
I like it.
That was decent. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the movie from the get go was in good hands. I mean, like you said, Tom Cruise may not be a director, but for all intents and purposes, the way he markets everything, the way he obviously produces things, and yeah, say what you will about the guy, and like any major A-lister, he has his detractors, and you know some of the things might be related to his off-screen life, I guess, but on screen, yeah, he's a complete pro, and you know the amount of effort he puts in, like you said, the whole training, all the co-cast to pilot the jets, even if it was at like a kind of a base value. And you could see that in all, you know, as he becomes an instructor, as he starts training these, you know, this young motley crew, it's almost like it almost becomes a sports movie, doesn't it? And you
Yeah.
could see
Yeah.
in their faces, they're almost terrified to be doing it because at one point or another, they are literally doing it. They are piloting the planes. So you can imagine. And as you said, the sequences are just nothing short of absolutely amazing in the cinema. I mean, I feel sorry for anyone who completely misses the cinema run because it's just something that I think it will be hard to replicate on a smaller screen in terms of, like you said, every shot has its place. And yes, the original had great flight sequences too. And I've seen movies where you could say, yeah, there's good flight sequences and all the rest. But for this, yeah, it was just without doubt the best aerial sequences I've ever seen, where you actually felt like you were in
Yeah.
there with them in the cockpit. Every time they go up at like a kind of an angle, ascending the mountains, you know, where it's just a tight edge, and you can see it in their faces as they get the adrenaline rush and everything else. Just yeah, couldn't have been better. Basically, the way they managed that.
Yeah, you were certainly insisting that I go and see it in the cinema. And of course, I am a proponent of seeing everything in the cinema, but certainly in terms of a sense of scale, it's magnificent. I don't know if you can see it in the cinema now, but it's doing so well at the box office, they might still leave it on. So you should see it. And you mentioned that it's a sports movie, and it is. It's almost multi genre at times in a way, because it plays like a sports movie, it plays like a heist movie later on, but just focusing on the the sports movie aspect of it at the moment, or more kind of like mentor teacher kind of dynamics. Now we're used to movies where, especially sports movie like American football, basketball, I guess, because America makes most of these movies. But there's a inspirational teacher who's maybe a burnout, maybe doesn't play by the rules. He gets one more chance to kind of make it right with these bunch of misfits. Now in this Maverick, he actually in the opening sequence we get the great. He succeeds, but then he kind of tries to punch it to like 11 and 12 and just decimates the jet, and which is a great kind of summarization of his character. So he gets kicked out or whatever, and he gets one chance to fly again. He's basically grounded until Iceman via text, which actually has more significance than I thought. I was like, why is Iceman and Maverick texting now? Is that what they do? But he gets one chance, and that's to train this team for a really kind of fascinating, dangerous mission, which again, talking about stakes, we'll get to that in a minute. But one thing I liked about the sports movie dynamic, if you will, and that is that these aren't a bunch of misfits. These are the elite squad of pilots that almost, instead of training to be the best, they almost need to be taken down a peg. We've got Miles Teller, of course, as Goose's son, going by the name Rooster. We've got, let me have a look now, because there's a few, isn't there?
Hangman is basically Iceman Mark II, and
Yeah, yeah,
like, as you said, with the setup of the whole sports drama, like within that, of course, there are tropes, and like unashamedly, there are tropes. There are even cliches here, but like we mentioned earlier, because it's done so well, because it's timed to pretty much perfection, it doesn't matter. And it's not just us being favorable of Tom Cruise saying we like this because it's a blockbuster. We talked about the financial success already, and the fact that it's been in the cinema the entire summer. I mean, I think it opened in May and it's September now, and like you said, if you want to see it, you still can. And on top of that as well, critics loved it, so you can see why. It's just like it's the perfectly packaged blockbuster in terms of right across the board.
yeah,
They didn't misjudge any sequence. People who like the original will be happy to kind of continue, and then also it's a bit standalone in some ways as well about the training
yeah,
aspect, because these are new characters, like you said, Rooster. You might remember Goose and compare him, or you might even have seen it, and you can still say, okay, this guy, it's a young guy who, like, has previous with Tom Cruise's Maverick character because of his dad's situation and everything else. And the same with
yeah,
Hangman being the cocky kind of, wants to be number one, wants to be the top gun, the elite pilot. So, as you
yeah.
mentioned, he needs to be taken down a peg or two or 10 maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a fan of tropes. I'm almost a fan of stereotypes in movies if they're done well. Because after all, we watch the same detective story, the same murder story. We watch the same kind of narrative again and again with moving blocks of pieces and updates to characters. And I think you talked about it's not being us being favorable, which is true. Now, I'm a big fan of 80s and 90s movies, but when I see them now, I can see that certain aspects of those movies are steeped in a little bit of my nostalgia. Now, Predator is a 5-star classic, but there's certain scenes in it that I imagine if I saw today that would kind of stick out a little bit as outdated. And there's a few sequences that are glaring in movies that I absolutely love, that I can accept they're from that time because I am from that time. Whereas I think if modern audiences watch them now, it kind of feels a bit unpolished. But what this movie does, I think, is polishes up those kind of tropes that I loved in the 80s and 90s, like a romance that's thrown in for no real deep reason, but it works with Jennifer Connelly. There's a bit of a bromance. There's a few like sparse threads like between Tom Cruise and the guy who let him take the plane and who wishes him luck at the end. There's just like typical 90s kind of little friendships. It doesn't mean anything, but it's done with a kind of modern day slickness to kind of update that formula that I really enjoyed. So I think it's an update of movies that I loved and you love for modern day audiences as well, which is another reason why I appreciated it.
Yeah, needless to say, it's poles apart from the original. It's a far better film on
Yeah.
every aspect you could measure it with. And like I said, as an 80s blockbuster of its time, that was a very serviceable action movie to see in the cinema. You'd be satisfied. But of course, the effects are better now, and the piloting sequence is better. Tom Cruise acting is much better in this. The character has, let's just say, motivations beyond being a guy who's smiling all the time, wanting to impress everyone, which is kind of like his raison d'etre, reason for being in the original, I guess, you know. And in this,
Yeah.
every character has a bit more depth. So it's almost a positive that the original was such a thinly scripted film, because they could kind of do what they wanted with the characters following the ones who came back, like him and Iceman, and even Rooster, who's, you know, just a little kid in the first one, but still they could do what they wanted and fill in the time in between and say, okay, this happened. And yeah, I think, yeah, despite all the flight sequences, I would say maybe my favorite scene in it wasn't necessarily a flight sequence, but we'll see if you agree with me on that. I think in terms of judging material well and having like a good kind of, yeah, a good impression of a landing. But yeah, I'll see.
Well, what was the scene, or is it? Do you want to discuss my Tom Cruise question first, or is that getting into spoiler territory, which we will get into soon?
The Tom Cruise question, what was that about?
No, I haven't asked it yet, but you mentioned that he's doing better acting than normal. I think it's more that he's personally, I think it's more that he's been given an opportunity to. He's always been a very good actor, but we've watched him, and even though I love these movies, we've watched him in Mission Impossible basically being a machine almost in terms of emotions. In this, we get to see a more human side to Tom Cruise's character. I don't think we've seen him play a kind of relatable character in a while. And even though he's a fighter pilot, it's much more of a human kind of relatability in terms of, you know, you're at that stage in your life and the mistakes you've made and trying to do things right. And there's one scene where he pulls some real deep emotion in terms of not being able to walk away. And I feel like he channels how perhaps he feels about movies himself in terms of Tom Cruise the actor, in terms of not being able to walk away from action sequences, not being able to walk away from the kind of movies he's been making. I feel like he channels some depth I haven't seen in Tom Cruise in a while.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. You know, it's been such a success, like we said, critically and commercially, that at this stage, I wouldn't rule out like Oscar nominations beyond the sound, editing, and everything else, because it is actually really well acted, and that's part of it, like the judgment. And yeah, I think that his acting has improved over the years. Like if you go back to, yeah, Risky Business, the original Top Gun, Mission Impossible is probably a different entity, isn't it? Like just like your James Bonds, you know, there are just so many things that they have to hit in terms of the beats with that it's probably harder to classify even alongside this, which is still a blockbuster, but they filled in so much kind of character background that it kind of
Yeah.
becomes its own, yeah, its own story. So I would say, yeah, for sure, comparing his character, you could say that there is a character now, whereas in the original Top Gun, he's really just a kind of fresh-faced cadet, you know, shit-eating grin, wants to kind of like show off as much as possible. And this is kind of like the Peter Pan style guy has grown up now, and
Yeah.
maybe he's fallen through some rungs where all of his co-pilots are, you know, fellow ex-training cadets are admirals and way beyond in terms of ranking and careers and everything. So he's still like he's doing what he wants, but he's in no way getting any younger. And I think that
Yeah.
judging that would have been difficult, but whatever he had to do was bang on.
Yeah. Well, certainly Iceman has taken a different trajectory in this movie compared to Maverick, who's still almost floating about where you would have expected him to be a few years after the original Top Gun, maybe. I'm going to get into the second half of the film now as well. So there's going to be a few spoilers, and Dennis, you can drop in anything you want that you perhaps didn't want to spoil before, and favorite scene and things like that. Now, I love the setup to this heist or mission, if you will. I can't remember verbatim, but there's a few things that need to go right for this mission to be a success. One team has to fly and hit a target, and then the other has to follow up and hit a target. They have to stay below a certain radar trajectory in order not to get hit. The stakes are massive, and then they have to scale this massive mountain at the end, and other things can go wrong as well. Now, the framing of Goose's death in the first movie actually adds another layer of stakes in the sense that if there was any casualty, it would feel like the mission has been a failure, because of the ramifications of Goose's original death, and Maverick is now the leader and almost the kind of surrogate dad of this team. So I was looking when they start off that mission, and I'm thinking, okay, Hangman definitely needs to get some kind of payoff for he's a very talented fighter, but he's arrogant and he isn't there for his teammate. He doesn't get chosen to go on the mission. And I'm thinking, okay, he needs to get a redemption at some point in terms of now he's there for his team. What team hasn't been featured enough? Because they're going to get killed by the enemy. That's where I thought it was going to go. My partner, who I watched it with, she thought Tom Cruise is going to die. And I don't know if that was me feeding into her anxiety, but I'm thinking maybe he can. And then I realized it's a franchise, so maybe not. But the fact that I even thought it was possible, because now if you kill off someone, you kill off you don't just kill off a character, you kill off billions of dollars potentially. So there's always that kind of thing to a franchise aspect as well. But that sequence in itself, when they actually carry out the mission, was nail biting, wasn't it?
Yeah, that sequence is outstanding. Just when they were scaling the mountains, and like you said, there were so many things that they had to get done, and the consequences and the characters at stake. And again, just seeing it in the cinema, it's just such a rush with all of that being done. And you can see other blockbusters in the cinema, and yeah, sure, they might be a little exciting, but as you said, any character at one time could have died, and you could have said, yeah, that would have an effect on the movie, and it would kind of have your perceptions kind of confirmed about, it being kind of unpredictable almost. And yeah, within each sequence as well, because like John Hamm, the admiral, or yeah, their commander, sets them up and says, you have to hit like these 4 targets, and each one is basically next to impossible. Of course, Maverick manages to do it in a training sequence when all of the other cadet pilots couldn't do it. So
yeah,
that was
great
shown
sequence.
to say that, okay, yeah, it can be done, but like we need him there to do it. That's why he goes with them on the mission, despite being, well, I guess like Tom Cruise is what, 60, even though he looks about 40 at most. But
yeah, 59, yeah.
59, yeah, there you go. So like, yeah, and his persona in real life, just like in this, it kind of there's a forever young kind of aspect to it, which really sets him up well to be the teacher to all of these people and be the guy who can actually fly the jet all the way and get the target hit on time, right on target. And yeah, that sequence is just so well directed as well. Just this tension, the nerves racking all the way through. I'm sure everybody was like edge of their seat watching that.
Yeah, you can get some. Fuck it, man. It's just Marvel movies, right? This is my bonnet. It's the only thing I can compare it to. I've liked plenty of Marvel movies, but this is just I can't. I'm trying to work around it so it just don't sound like too. Well, you've kept quiet, but I know you agree with me to an extent. So we don't sound like two ancient cinema goers. But it's impossible to make my point, right? You can get some wizard or some ancient being with swirls destroying the universe, and it will not mean nothing to me, even though because you expect me to believe the proposition that the world is ending is enough for me to be invested. But it feels hollow anytime the world ends now in movies, largely. In this, on paper, it just sounds like the most generic, by action movie standards nowadays, low stakes thing you can have. But there's one sequence where there's 2 unnamed enemy fighters, and I'll get to that in a minute. That's my gripe with this movie. And I think it's 2 on 1. And Tom Cruise and Miles Teller, Rooster, Maverick, they take out one, but they get outsmarted by this cool unnamed enemy fighter, and even just saying that. And Maverick does this cool maneuver, fires this rocket. You think it's going to take out the fighter. And just because it's so shot in the realm of physicality. When the fighter just pulls out of the way with this maneuver, you can feel the G-force, you can feel the movement in the air, pulls, the missile misses. It's just someone dodging a missile, man. That sequence was like shit. Like that was like, in my head, that is now the greatest pilot ever, just because he pulled this maneuver off. He doesn't need to be some ancient lord down some lineage to be badass. He doesn't need to do this elaborate thing. Just dodge that bullet in that way. That captivated me. That reminded me of sandboxing when I was a kid, in terms of just the exhilaration you get from just the most, like a kid holding two action figures up and dodging it. Just hit that type of imagination for something that's real, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100% in the Marvel thing too. I mean, the problem is that there's so much, for starters, with the TV shows, the spin-offs. And as you said, they can't just keep raising the stakes every time the planet's a danger. Okay, what do you do the next time and the next time after that? And clearly, the characters come back to life, all the rest. So as you said, it's kind of, they're not going to take risks. Let's put it that way. And you might watch those movies and enjoy them at the time, but it's kind of like the popcorn or the recent McDonald's you had, whatever, it's just going to be completely forgotten by the time you get home. Whereas with this, like, I remember just all the details, the fine tuning of every training sequence, and yeah, especially obviously that the last action sequence, which kind of keeps going on as well. I mean, there's technically 2 or 3 different action sequences, but let's just say from the get-go, when they go out to hit the targets in the mountains, followed by when, as you said, the enemy jets start going after them. Because the stakes, again, are on the team, the characters that we spent the movie with, in a sports team style training setup. And again, you're thinking, who's not going to make it? In these movies, they've hit all the tropes, kind of as you'd expect to at times, but in such a well developed, such a well packaged way that it's just, it's kind of like what the ultimate blockbuster should do. And again, I would, it's not over the top to say that this is, as blockbusters go, it's up there, not, if not quite, with say a Terminator 2, which is probably, because I think that was a summer blockbuster, which is kind of recognized as the best blockbuster of all time, you could say. But it's not far off, because there's not much more that you could do to get the movie kind of right. I would say there's no misapprehension. There's nothing where they don't hit their beats on target. There's nothing where like kind of characters don't act like how they should or out of place, and the action is just amazing. So yeah, as a blockbuster, it's hard to fault.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't quite put it as close to Terminator 2, but I get your point. It has thrills and spills and everything else. It doesn't have any puns, but I will tell you one point, and I'm going to have to get into spoilers, so hopefully people have either stopped this and gone to the cinema or have seen it, who've watched it. There's one part that I had a bit of a problem with. The faceless enemies, I'm surprised that they didn't. Where did you say that they didn't export this to? China?
China and Russia, because of the situation with Ukraine and everything else. But that's the reason it didn't get released in Russia. I think China is because of a very minute detail about Tom Cruise's bomber jacket, where apparently he has a Taiwan flag. So about the whole Taiwan-China situation, basically, that is very much a kind of misnomer. And that seems to be the leading reason. And other major studios would have been told that in the past, and they say, okay, we'll edit it, we'll change it. But, Tom Cruise is being apolitical, I would say, to say that, no, that's staying in. Why would I take out something that it's our movie that we've been working on for this amount of time? So many delays. Like, I mean, he wanted Tony Scott to direct it, and obviously he passed away about 8 or 9 years ago. And so, like, it's been that level of delay. And Tom is saying, I'm not getting into the whole political football kind of thing, saying, oh, well, if you do put it in, then they won't be offended, and so on and so forth. So that was the main reason that the China market didn't go in. Referring back to what you're saying about the faces enemies, in terms of like they should have just picked a country, you're saying, or something along those lines?
Well, my problem was, because, and this is me putting it politely, but either they didn't want to offend, they wanted it to market it to everyone and anyone for whatever reason, and it goes beyond nameless and faceless. They're speechless, and there's certain shots that are missing because they chose not to show anybody. We would get a shot of some language, some person speaking when the towers are getting blowing up. We would get shots of an alien player going, if he is German, going schnell, 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 or whatever. We would get these extra kind of shots, an extra bit of blocking that we didn't get because the enemies felt completely hollow and non-existent. Now, I'm not talking about the sequences. I'm talking about the enemies themselves. And as the enemies were being shown, at first I found it strange. And then I realized we are not going to get any shots of these enemies whatsoever as characters. And it kind of feels like a computer game where they run out of the budget and you just go down to this town that doesn't exist and isn't filled in because they ran out of money or didn't bring in the fine details. And so much so that later on we get, again, it's a great sequence because I would have been happy for the heights, but spoilers, Maverick and Goose both get shot down in enemy territory. Now, in a movie where they commit to actually having an enemy presence in terms of characterization, we get searching, we get a little bit of a few extra bit of blocking and dialogue of them at least saying something in subtitles. Or, I would have just had fucking Irish, Scottish, Sudanese, Yemen. I would just get a bunch of people together and they're dissidents from their country and they want to do
French
something,
Foreign
right?
Legion.
If we don't want to offend anyone, yeah. If we don't want to offend anyone, just get everyone in and just get everyone from everyone. Get everybody. Get non-gender fluid.
I mean,
like terrorists, whatever. Bring everybody in. Bring everybody.
I can see that point of view, and maybe it does go back to the fact that yes, Tom wanted to hit everywhere, which he got, which might end up being ironic with the whole China and Russia situation. One being out of their hands, and one refusing to change something, which I completely agree with him on, by the way. But
yeah,
I think I've seen some stuff online where people have been trying to assume and say, okay, what does it mean? It's a kind of it's a forest, it's snow, and you kind of list off
yeah,
it can't be. The enemies seem
yeah,
kind of like American size, so you would say they're not like an Asian country as such. So it's probably not Canada. It's probably not Scandinavia. I guess you can kind of narrow
yeah.
it down pretty quickly. The countries that have snow and forests. So yeah, it all
But
but says it. But yeah,
I think I don't care who it is or who they're not trying to show, but we just lose some shots because of it. And so much so when they crash on the enemy land and they're having fights with the enemy, they don't exist. That's my one gripe with it. It's I wouldn't say it's a minor gripe. It's not something that ultimately took away from my enjoyment, but it is obvious. It's very obvious and distracting. It's distractingly obvious.
yeah, I don't think I feel as strongly about it as you, and it's probably for the reason that it's not often done. In usual blockbusters, sometimes they make an absolute fucking hash of like trying to do the enemy so bad that it just fires on a level that you're like, Jesus Christ, these whoever these people are supposed to be, they're clearly not. And when it gets to that
Durka
stage,
Durka Muhammad Jihad.
yeah, on the Team America scale, like, and of the movies Team America's parody, obviously, like, yeah. So it could
Yeah.
have gone like badly wrong within seconds, and if you're relying on Hollywood for kind of, let's say, accuracy when it comes to foreign nations, then you got another thing coming. As
Yeah.
Rob Halford used to say, yeah. So I don't think it bothered me as much because the sequences go by so fast, and
It
again,
is
I
true.
just assume like it's kind of enemy distance from the east, let's say, to put it mildly. But yeah, they got through
Yeah.
quite quickly, and for me as well, it's moving so fast that you're so invested in them getting back, and then it kind of loops around to that scene again, doesn't it? That you were talking about, where the enemy pilots are coming after them, and he takes out the first guy, and then yeah,
Yeah.
so like
It
it
was
just gets
brilliant.
back to that really, really fast.
Yeah. So what was your favorite scene then you alluded to earlier?
So this surprised me as well because like I said, I wasn't a massive fan of the original. I wasn't in any way invested in Iceman's character before the start, but I felt when him and Tom got finally met up together after you said they'd been texting for a while and it seemed a bit unusual, and the guy was like riddled, sick with cancer to the point that he couldn't even speak much, which is how like Val Kilmer has been for a while because he's been through some bad times with cancer in real life. So it wasn't
Right.
hope, but again, it's one of those sequences. If they'd mismanaged it, just like say the enemies, if they had committed to like an enemy, if they'd mismanaged it, that would have backfired so badly. That could have been, Hallmark Seventh Heaven level if they'd mismanaged it. But it went the opposite.
Right.
It's like, the second he started communicating with him, and you can't even say talking. Tom is talking to Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer's typing on his machine. It just,
Yeah.
I instantly felt that, like, 30-year friendship thing that he was talking about. He's always getting him out of trouble. It just clicked right away for me. And like, that's why yeah, maybe it is my favorite sequence, but alongside that action scene, just because I wasn't expecting that level of depth from a Top Gun sequel, not in a million years. But
Yeah.
yeah, it sounds funny to say it, but it just
It's
instantly it rang true.
it's such an emotional scene, and not just because of Val Kilmer's own issues. Because I was thinking it's kind of funny to play a character who's like dealing with terminal cancer and then shooting your own funeral the next sequence from something that you've recovered from as an actor. It must be quite difficult to get in that place. But you're certainly right in that scene where they finally do meet the face, and in a line lacking so much actual audible dialogue, it you can kind of fill in a 30-year bond and relationship between these two people in that sequence that really has a lot of gravitas that you wouldn't expect. And I read actually after the fact that Val Kilmer can't actually speak at all. He actually lost his ability to speak, and they actually synthesized something that would sound like him in the one or two lines he actually does deliver in this movie. So that makes it even more extraordinary how they managed to shoot the sequence, and just the level of emotion it brought to obviously you if it's one of your favorite scenes, but also me.
Yeah, like you said, it could have just misfired so badly, and I guess there's not that many that came into it, because obviously Goose, his sidekick, died in the original. The flight instructor didn't come back, which is no loss, because I think it would have been very hard to crowbar her back in 35 years later. Instructors go to academies, and they had a fling in the original, whatever. I think that wouldn't have worked anyway. So what did work was his relationship with Jennifer Connelly, because apparently in the original, Goose is talking to him about like his textured love life, let's just say, and he said, "Oh yeah, the admiral's daughter," and apparently that, like, she gets name checked in the original without being in it. So that's
Right.
clever, like just even that something as seemingly throwaway as that. So they've already got the backstory, as basic as it might be. But again, Jennifer Connelly kind of is from that whole Tom Cruise Fountain of Youth thing. So she has a kind of similar style, similar lifestyle, we'll
Yeah.
say kind of adventurous type. So it just works. It makes sense, and again, maybe she's missed some things in life that other people her age got, that they both seem kind of like relics in a way of being hanging around the air bases when people much younger are working there, and yeah, people of their age have moved
Well,
on, that kind of thing. Yeah.
well, my friend actually brought this up about typical movie economics. It's certainly in the pub sequence where if you disrespect the barmaid, everyone gets around, and then how does that work in terms of that's a lot of money, and then if you can't pay, you get thrown out. Except she's fucking rich. She's got a yacht. So why is she hanging around in this bar? But
Yeah.
that was just a side thing of a bit of movie economics that I found amusing. But yeah, I think we're both in agreement. This movie is really good. I actually wouldn't mind a few more Top Gun movies, but I say that tentatively. I wouldn't mind Christopher McQuarrie to maybe take over in terms of the script writing. At least I think he had a hand in producing this. I wouldn't mind seeing one or two, because funny enough, there is actually places they can go in. You wouldn't think so based on the first one.
Yeah, and just because it's, as a sequel goes, I mean, it's up there in the sequel arguments now, and I guess it has to be in terms of like your aliens,
Right.
just in terms of like surpassing an original, and it does on every level. Like, we agree, and that's all too rare for sure. I mean, most sequels kind of have the modus operandi. Okay, go bigger, more explosions. That's
Mm.
usually the blockbuster criteria. They don't say more character development, make the characters
Yeah.
multifaceted, which they ended up doing. Yeah, so like, just again, yeah, speaks to the professionalism of Tom Cruise and McQuarrie, like you said, with the Mission Impossibles and everything else. They've become de facto screenwriting, screen producing partners in the last 10 years. And it's working too. I mean, I haven't seen The Mummy, but for all intents and purposes, apart from that, their relationship seems to be bearing fruit most of the time as a partnership.
Yeah, I don't have time to get into The Mummy right now, Dennis. But I do have one final question for you. What would your pilot name be? Your avatar? I'm thinking the nanny or the teacher nowadays for you, or fine wine down there in Singapore. You know what's the
Question. Hopefully not. Hopefully not redneck.
Jake Gyllenhaal is what you're known as in Asia, right?
Yeah, yeah. Redneck Gyllenhaal. How about yourself?
All right, well, you have what Shelby.
Oh yeah, yeah. I shouldn't be the one forgetting that. Yeah.
All right, we'll leave it there. So we'll come back in a few weeks. You might do. I'm hesitant to say what movie, but we'll try and bring you guys a bit more regular movie reviews. Many thanks, Dennis. I'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Cheers, Andy. Always a pleasure. All right, let me